Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad. God is one, the great statement of Jewish monotheism. There are some items that we're so familiar with that we don't think about them very deeply. We just take them for granted. And if you do start to think about them, you can suddenly lose your bearings and feel that something is very, very foggy. Let's try this. We're saying that God is one. Let's imagine an ancient Greek. An ancient Greek who believes in 14 gods. Imagine he says, Zeus is one. Zeus is one. Now, in his worldview, in his picture of how the world runs, is his statement true or false? Zeus is one.
False. True.
Zeus is one? How many would Zeus be? What's the truth? Oh, you think it's zero. But in his mindset, in his worldview, of course Zeus is one. Zeus isn't the committee. Zeus is one of the many gods. Right? There are other ones, and Zeus is one of them. When he says Zeus is one, what he's saying in his picture of the world is certainly correct. When he says Zeus is one, it does not make him a monotheist. So how does our saying that God is one make us monotheists? Maybe God, or if you've seen books like the Art Scroll where they transliterate Hashem, Hashem, and we say Hashem is one, maybe that just means he's one of the many. How does our declaration, Hashem is one, make us monotheists? Indeed, if you look it up among the really clever academics, there's something called, between monotheism and polytheism, there's something in between called henotheism. Henotheism. Henotheism means maybe there are 100 gods. I don't know. Frankly, I don't care. I pledge allegiance to this one. In my allegiance, in my loyalty, there's only one. Maybe there are others. I'm not prejudiced in that regard. Maybe there are. I'm just not interested. And they worry about whether our texts imply more than henotheism, whether we really are monotheists. But anyway, what is going on when we have this declaration, 6 words in Hebrew? One of the first things you teach a child, it's what a Jew says if he knows he's going to die. And we take it as the declaration of monotheism. And when you start to look at it in logical terms, the content doesn't seem to be there. Is the question that I'm asking clear? Okay. I'm prejudiced. My field was philosophy, mathematics, logic, so I want things to make literal sense. And when I discovered that it's hard to see what the literal sense is, it began to bother me. Now, there's a grand philosophical tradition which has a gigantic explanation of what these words mean. There's a Kabbalistic tradition that has explanation of what these words mean. I'm not going to take you through all of that because you're not going to be here for 2 months. At least not in this room for 2 months. I'll give you a skim off the surface of the philosophical idea, quoting Maimonides and others. And then I'll give you a simple way to understand it that I can provide you with, which avoids all of those great issues. Maimonides says, when it tells us God is one, it means God is one in every respect, in every dimension, in every connection, in every application. The only number that could apply to God is one. No other number could truly apply to him. Okay, so what? Well, Maimonides says, if that's true, then immediately God can't be physical. God can't be physical. Because almost all physical things have parts. And so you'll have the number of parts. And then the number one won't be the only number that applies. This will be the number of parts. And even if you'll tell me there are things that don't have parts, now I'm not sure in Maimonides' world whether there was any such thing. Aristotle says things could be divided ad infinitum. But if you think of elementary particles, if there really are elementary particles, if you think of elementary particles, you could still distinguish aspects. An electron has mass, it has charge, and it has spin, intrinsic angular momentum. Those are three aspects that the electron has, and therefore, number one isn't the only number that applies to the electron. There's also the three elementary qualities that it has. Or as Maimonides says, physical things have substance and form, and that means every physical thing has at least two aspects, substance and form. So if you say that God can have only the number one, then no other number applying, you know right away that God is not physical. If you push this reasoning a little bit harder, then you're going to get into trouble. I mean, Maimonides pushes it. What about qualities of God altogether? We think of God as omniscient, knowing everything, omnipotent, all-powerful. We think of God as just. That's three. Shall we keep going? We think of God as merciful. We think of God as creator. That's five. Shall we keep going? Obviously, if you think about qualities that God has, there are going to be a bunch. And then you'll have the number of the qualities. If I'm going to say no number applies to God other than one, none at all, we're going to be stuck without qualities. Maimonides says, that's right. That's right. No qualities. This is what we were talking about before they came in. No qualities. Well, if there are no qualities, how can you talk about them? Don't you talk about a thing by talking about its qualities? Says Maimonides, we talk about what he does, not about what he is. We don't know what he is. All we know is what he does. That's part 1, chapter 54 in the guide. If you want to look it up, where Maimonides talks about it in detail. Only what he does, not what he is. Now, at this point, the independent-minded critic will say, boy, that's a dodge. That's a real dodge. You're in trouble. You're stuck. You're facing a difficulty, so you just dodge out of it and say, we don't talk about what he is, we talk about what he does. That's religion for you. Religion doesn't say anything. Religion can't give you any serious information. And that's just a dodge. But as a matter of fact, if you'll ask physics about what it believes in, you'll get the same answer. Because if you think of the elementary particles and you think of their qualities, all the qualities are qualities of what they do, not what they are. Bertrand Russell pointed this out, Arthur Eddington pointed this out, and modern philosophers also have echoed this idea. Let's take, for example, mass, the mass of a particle. Mass means inertial mass. Inertial mass means how much does it resist force that wants to make it move. The more mass, the more resistance. Mass describes what it does when a force is applied to it. Charge. Electrons have what we call negative electromagnetic charge. That means electrons repel one another. Try to push them together, it gets harder and harder. Proton and electron will attract one another because proton is positively charged, electron is negatively charged. Charge is how the electron interacts with others. Spin, which is intrinsic angular momentum, means like this. You aim one thing at another and hit, you normally think it will bounce off this way. Not with an electron. If you hit it this way, it bounces off that way. It bounces off as if it's spinning. Spin is what happens when you hit it with something else. That's what spin is. All you know about these particles is what they do. You don't know what they are. Physics is entirely silent on what they are. So if you're going to turn up your nose against religion on the grounds that they say that we don't know what God is, we only know what God does, then you're going to have to reject physics also. Because physics doesn't tell you anything more about the particles of what they do, doesn't tell you what they are. So apparently that's not an intellectual dodge, it's not a mistake, it's not a cheat, it's just the condition that we can be in when we're investigating the world, and sometimes that's all you get. So,
Am I allowed to ask a question?
Sure.
The categories of the electron that the Rav described are also, as the Rav said, characteristics of what they do.
The only characteristics we have of them are characteristics of what they do. Right.
So we said that if Hashem is one, he can't be physical, because even the smallest physical thing that we know, which is an electron, also has a number.
Right.
But Hashem also has a number of characteristics, like the electron has a number of characteristics.
Right. So I answered that. What did I say?
I don't recall.
No, what I said was, we are not going to talk about Hashem having characteristics. We're going to reject that idea for that reason. If he really has characteristics, then there'll be a number other than one that applies to him, just like with the electron. So we're going to reject it. Then you'll say to me, but if you reject talking about his characteristics, how can you talk about him at all? When you talk about something, you talk about its characteristics, how big it is, where it is, what it weighs, how much it costs. That's what you do when you talk about things. Answer, we don't talk about what he is, we only talk about what he does. What he does can be many things. The rejection of number is only to what he is, not to what he does. Okay, and then I said, if you're going to tell me that's a dodge, then I'm going to say that it's no more a dodge than you have in physics. Because all physics tells you about the electron is what it does, not what it is. It's just the way we are sometimes. Okay, so then the whole of the Jewish tradition, whether you talk about the Bible, the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, and the Talmud, and the Midrash, and the prayer books, and all the rest, which talk about God, all of that talk has to be translated into talking about what he does, not about what he is. By the way, the Kabbalistic tradition agrees on this point word for word. This is something where the philosophical tradition and the Kabbalistic tradition both agree word for word. We never talk about what God is, we only talk about what he does. Okay, so that now is a useful piece of information. That's not trivial. That's not just what someone who says Zeus is one would mean. And therefore, the statement makes some literal sense. By the way, the statement starts with, "Hear, O Israel, Hashem our God, Hashem is one." We ought to ask why hearing is so important. Are the ears really crucial here? Suppose that it said, "See that God is one." Would that have been less impressive somehow? Less significant? Less meaningful? The word in Hebrew for hear also is a word for understand. The Shema in Hebrew can mean and means in the Torah, in at least two places, in the book of Genesis and in the book of Deuteronomy, that it means to understand. So, the text is challenging us not to hear with the ears, but to understand with the mind. And what I just told you is something which requires some understanding. I wouldn't be able to explain to a 10-year-old what I just explained to you. A 10-year-old couldn't grasp it. It requires some understanding. And I'm just skimming the very, very surface. Now, there's another way to do the job here. In very simplistic terms, this isn't found in the traditional sources. I'm using this because of my training. That's the way I explain it to myself when I want it to be more simple, more familiar. We talk about things, people, books. We speak about them by using a name and then saying something. Moby Dick is a famous American novel. Kathmandu is the subject of a horrific catastrophe that took place yesterday. I use a name to talk about a thing. But that's not always true. Sometimes we don't use the name to talk about the thing. Sometimes we use the name to talk about the qualities of the thing. I'll give you an example. We're setting up a literary club. And we want to have an author who's our symbol. Somebody suggests Charles Dickens. And I say, Charles Dickens? That's a symbol? Do you know that his books were published in periodicals? Magazines in Britain. They came out once a month, and he had a chapter, like serials that we have today in various... and then later he put them together into books. Okay, they're entertaining in certain ways, charming in certain ways, but Charles Dickens, take Mark Twain. Of course, I'm speaking as an American, but okay. Take Mark Twain. Mark Twain was very significant. He wrote fundamental novels. He has a book of essays, 1,000 pages thick, essays on all different kinds of subjects. Really fascinating reading. I want to pick somebody, and I say it like this. There are many Charles Dickens. There's only one Mark Twain. There are many Charles Dickens. There's only one Mark Twain. Now, what am I saying? Am I saying, I've done some literary research, and I found out that Charles Dickens is really a committee. No, it was divided up. There were 3 different people who used that name and wrote the novels. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is the qualities Charles Dickens had as a writer are common. They're common. Lots of writers have those qualities. Mark Twain was unique. No one else has the literary qualities of Mark Twain. That's what I'm saying. I'll give you another example. Now, this dates me. You probably haven't heard of Mark Spitz. Mark Spitz was a great American, great American Jewish athlete. He won 5 gold medals at the Olympic Games. It was 10 years ago or 15 years ago.
Was he the diver?
He was a swimmer. I don't know what he did 5 different things, but 5 different medals. I say to you, there'll never be another Mark Spitz. Am I commenting on the Spitz families of the world, that none of them will ever name their son Mark? That's not the point of my remark. Well, the point of my remark is, as an athlete, he was unique. No one else is going to have those athletic qualities. So sometimes when you use a name, you're not talking about the person, you're talking about the qualities of the person. Okay, let's try that over here. When we say Hashem is one, maybe we're not talking about him, so to speak, which then becomes trivial. It's no different from the Greek who says Zeus is one. Let's talk about qualities. Leaving aside what I said about Maimonides at the moment, if you like, I can put the two of them together later. Let's see if we can think of qualities of Hashem. And what we'll be saying is that he's the only one to have those qualities. Let's see whether that helps get back to monotheism. What qualities are related to Hashem, specifically under that name? When in the English you have Hashem, in the Hebrew you have God's proper name in Hebrew, a Yud and a Hey and a Vav and a Hey. A word which is mispronounced Jehovah. It's not what it means in Hebrew, and it's not the way it's pronounced in Hebrew. Indeed, we don't know how it's pronounced. The vowel points that are printed in the books that use vowel points come from a different name altogether, because we don't know the vowel points for this name, so there's no way to pronounce the name. It's that specific name, which is in some sense more proper to God than any other name. That's what the English registers as Hashem. That name is based on a root in Hebrew which means to be. Hoveh in Hebrew means to be, to exist. And that name connotes the quality of being the root of all existence. Making things be. Giving things their existence. Now, Hashem Echad, Hashem is one, says there's only one that gives existence to others. There might have been a committee. There could have been 100. Each one give existence to its group. But no, that's not true. There's only one that gives existence to others. So then I ask you, where did this table come from? Oh, it came from the factory that makes tables. Where did the factory come from? Well, those guys assembled the factory. Now trace it back, trace it back. Eventually, you're going to have to come back to the one who gives existence. Otherwise, you're going to go from this cause to this cause to this cause to this cause, and this one will have another thing that made it happen. Eventually, everything traces back to what gives existence. If there's only one that gives existence, then everything traces back to that one. That means, in English, creator. If there's one who gives existence to everything else, that's the definition of creator. All of a sudden, this statement says that we are monotheists. There is one that gives existence to everything else. So that's a way to understand it where it does become a statement of monotheism, and then it plays the role for us that it ought to play. Are we together so far? Okay, good. This is a good example of what happens when you start to study Jewish sources. Things that you, in a way, took for granted somehow turn out not to be. First of all, when you start, they seem to be difficult to grasp, difficult to make sense out of. And then when you push, you find that the tradition has really quite sophisticated, quite deep explanations for what's going on. Let's go on a little bit in the Shema and see how it develops. You should love Hashem with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your resources. Me'odecha, ma'od, although it's usually an adverb, but it can be a noun. When it's a noun, it means resources. Now I read that and I think, okay, love God with all my heart. I guess that means I should be dedicated to God. Pledge allegiance, try to make sure that my life is focused on doing what He wants. Oh, my soul, that means if there are cases where God tells me, don't do it at pain of your life, I have to be willing to give up my life. One example that the Talmud talks about is if somebody puts a gun to my head and says, kill so-and-so, I can't do it. I've got to be willing to die. So I love God with all my heart, I love God with all my soul, and also my bank account. Doesn't that seem a little anticlimactic, And the bank account, wouldn't that be included in loving God with all your heart and with all your soul? There is a subtle idea here that I think is very instructive and very important for everyone who wants to live a responsible life. My mother-in-law, Allah Shalom, lived through the 1929 stock market crash in the United States, and she told me that there was a very curious and remarked upon phenomenon at the time. There were suicides, as you must have read. People who lost their money, some of them jumped off buildings, committed suicide. The question at that time was raised. This guy lost his money, jumped off a building, killed himself. If 2 years before a child of his had died, would he have jumped off a building and killed himself? Probably not. That doesn't happen. Tragically, children die and parents don't commit suicide. And yet here, when the stock market crashed, some people committed suicide. So now, suppose 2 years before you asked this guy, what do you love more, your money or your children? What would he say? He'll say, my children. And he's not lying. He's not lying. But look, when he loses his money, he jumps off his building. Is that better for his children or worse? Much worse. In addition to being impoverished and now orphans. But what happened? If he loves his children more than his money, how could he commit suicide and leave his children as orphans when he lost his money? The answer is the money ate away at his identity without his even knowing about it. He didn't know that he had become so dependent upon money that he would leave his children as orphans. He didn't know that. Money has a way of eating you out from the inside without your even being conscious of it. I remember an interview about 20 years ago. I was in New York. I'm in New York quite regularly. I'll be there next week. By the end of this week. With a yuppie, 25 years old, vice president in some big firm. They asked her, how much money do you need to live on per year? So she thought for a minute, and she said, I think I could make it on $100,000 a year. That was 20 years ago, when $100,000 bought more than it does today. So I thought to myself, okay, what is she doing at the age of 25 to earn $100,000 a year? She's working 50 weeks a year, 70 to 80 hours a week. Does she have a life? Does she have friends? Does she have recreation? Does she travel? Does she read? Does she work out? No. She is what Karl Marx used to call the wage slave. She's a slave for that wage. Does she know that she's a slave? Does she know that she has no life? No, she knows she's got a salary in 6 figures. Does she realize what she's giving up? I'm not sure. So the Torah here is telling us, love God with all your heart, love God with all your soul, and take some time out to think about yourself. Who am I? Where am I going? What am I doing? What are my priorities? What's happening to the balance of my life? Now, you're here for a short trip or for a longer trip? How long are you going to be here?
Leaving tomorrow.
You're leaving tomorrow. How long have you been here?
A week in Poland and now a week in Israel.
Okay, so you haven't had a chance. One thing you'll do, and then when you come back next time, I always say the first trip is when you make the itinerary for the second trip. You get to meet people here. And you go around and see how people live. If you come from middle-class America, you would never dream of living like this. Never. You could have a family of 2 parents and 8 children in a house with 2 bedrooms, or most 3 bedrooms. In America, that would be regarded as overcrowding, and to get the social workers in and so forth and so on. Now you look around here, do you find people in despair, people with high drug use or high alcohol use because they're living in such terrible conditions that they can't face life? You don't find that. One of the things I learned on my first trip to Israel was that the standard of living that people have in the West, and I'm not preaching against it, but to think of it as a necessity is a mistake, because there are people who live on a much more modest level of economic support and who live happy lives, fulfilled lives, satisfied lives, creative lives. So maybe there's a mental set that's built into a certain stage of a culture, but it's only built in the culture. It's not built in your genes, not built in your biology, that you have to have this kind of expense. We live in houses with crushed stone floors, not marble. This place was redesigned by someone who lives outside the land of Israel and had mercy on us and gave us some pretty nice stuff. We don't live in houses like this. There's no all-season climate control. We don't take 3-week-long vacations to Mexico. And somehow, people are still happy and satisfied and fulfilled, not aching after getting away. So that's part of what the Torah is telling you here. To love God with all your resources means, among other things, it means pay attention to what's happening to you. Pay attention to your attachment to physical things, because physical things can eat away your identity without your even knowing it. The guy who says, I'm really in a pickle. I have a 2011 Porsche. I'm embarrassed to go out on the street. All my neighbors have 13s and 14s. Some of them have 15s. And I have an 11. And I'm a little short of money, so I'm going to work an extra 10 hours a week to get a 2014 or 15 Porsche so I can hold my head up in the neighborhood. Really? That's what you're working for? To hold your head up in the neighborhood? You're dedicating a large portion of your life to that? Is it worth it? Is it really worth it? That's something that the Torah wants us to think about. The Shema goes on. I want to just come to the end and leave you with that, and then if you have a few minutes for questions. The last thing in the first paragraph of the Shema is tefillin and mezuzah. After ideas of God's oneness and being creator and loving God with your heart, soul, and all your resources and respect to all the rest, parchment, texts written on parchment, put into leather boxes or put into scrolls on the doorway, seems like an anticlimax. You know? Okay, maybe it's important. So, but does it belong in the same paragraph with these exalted ideas? Doesn't it seem like a big letdown at the end of the paragraph? Now, one simple answer is, in the tefillin and in the mezuzah, this paragraph is written. So, it's a nice place to tell you that you have to have tefillin and mezuzah. But there's something much more profound going on here in addition. What is religion? What is religion about? There are many religions. You're aware of at least some of them. And some stress the mind and the heart. Religion is about understanding the world the way it really is and being spirited and generous and caring about other people and caring about the environment and so forth and so on. That's what religion is about. The physical world, at best, is means to that, or a way to express that, but that's not where it counts. Where it counts is in the mind and the heart. The Jewish message is that that's incorrect. That your interaction with the physical world is also crucial. Many of the commandments teach us how it is that we are supposed to interact with the physical world as well. You put the tefillin on your arm, on your head. One thing that's communicated is you can make the body holy. You can sanctify the body also. Not only the mind and the heart, which you might think of as the soul, is holy, the body can be made holy also, can be made holy. And not only the body, but your whole physical environment can be made holy. You put them on the doorposts of your house. The doorway in a house leads you from room to room. Rooms have different functions. There's a living room, and a dining room, and a kitchen, and a bedroom, and a study, and a garage, and the tool room, because they're different functions. When you move from room to room, you think, okay, I'm moving to a different function. Can I make this part of the house also holy by the way I function in this part of the house? And you put them on the gates of the city. The whole city can be made holy. The challenge is to project the values of religion into the physical environment in which you live. There's a story of a Hasidic Rabbi who was changing residence. And this is 150 years ago or 200 years ago in Europe. So he piled up all of his goods on a wagon and started to drive. He gets about a block away from his house and stops the driver and says, I forgot something. And he goes back. One of his children, young child, follows his father back to the house to see what he forgot. Sees his father go into the house, go over to the bookshelves, empty now because he took the books, and he kisses the bookshelves. So the child says to his father, what's that? Why are you doing that? And the father says to the child, these books held, these shelves held holy books. I forgot to say goodbye to them. The fact that they held holy books means that the holiness of the books had an effect on them. And therefore they're an item of concern, an item of identification. Now maybe some of you have heard of the holiday of Sukkot, where you build a kind of structure and a thatched roof, and you live in the thatched roof structure for a week. Religious Jews do that every year. I was very close to the Boston Rabbi of Boston. I was close to him for 45 years. On many occasions, we witnessed him saying goodbye to the sukkah. Saying goodbye. He lived in it for 7 days. Just minutes before Sukkot ends, before another holiday begins, he would go around and kiss all the walls and climb a ladder and kiss the roofing. If you experience that, you experience something that will stay with you for a lifetime. You saw the love that he had for this physical object because this physical object enabled him to do a mitzvah. The Gaon of Vilna, one of the greatest scholars, including a mystic, he was a master of Jewish mysticism, and one of the greatest authorities in Jewish law, when he was on his deathbed, was crying. And they asked him, why are you crying? He said, this beautiful world, a world in which for a few pennies you can buy strings and you could do a mitzvah, and I'm leaving this world. That's what he thought about, the strings on your gun. Just string, and you could do a mitzvah with it. God created this physical world not as a throwaway. He created this physical world not just as a temptation to be avoided. He created this physical world as an opportunity. Every item in this physical world has a certain spiritual potential. The commandments of the Torah tell you how to realize that spiritual potential in each item that you come across. So the physical world is itself a crucial spiritual resource. Don't just ignore it. That's part of the message in the end of the Shema, where it says, yes, take leather boxes and leather straps and parchment and bind it on your arm and put it on your doorposts and put it on the gates of your cities. Okay, any questions that you have that I can help you with?
So living in Israel is like, you really have to separate what you need from what you want.
Absolutely.
Like, without a doubt. Like,
that's right. And how do you do that?
It's hard.
The way you do it, if you can be honest with yourself or if you understand yourself well enough, is to ask yourself, what happens if I don't get it? By the way, my wife, who does counseling, especially for marriage, says that before you get married, you need to make out lists. 2 of the lists are what you need and what you want. And it's crucial to be different, to distinguish them, because if you meet someone who doesn't have what you need, it's 0. If you don't have what you need, you're not going to be able to survive. Doesn't have what you want, then you can think, okay, can I do without this? How much will it cost me? And so forth and so on. And the other thing she says is you need to have a list of what you can provide in a relationship. A list of gives. This, I think, is a very profound idea, and she's been teaching it for decades, so I haven't seen it written anywhere else. But each person, as we used to say in English, everyone needs to be needed. If nobody needs you, then you have the feeling that your life is worthless. And you may very well be right. If nobody needs you, then your life doesn't have any value. Indeed, look at what happens to people when they retire from work. Many of them go into deterioration. Spiritual, emotional, and physical deterioration. Because I had to get up at 7:30 because I had to be there by 9 o'clock. I had to. That means somebody depended upon me. I was making a contribution. Now I can sleep till 12 and nobody cares. Nobody cares. Well, if nobody cares, then what am I worth? Because I'm not giving anything to anybody. Now you get into a relationship, you have your wish list to say, well, I'm looking for a woman that has 1 through 6. And this woman who has 1 through 6 says, yes, I want you. But I want you to know, I don't need you for anything. You're not going to be happy. Everyone needs to be needed. Everyone needs to feel he's making a contribution. So you really need 3 lists. You need what I want, what I need, and what I can offer to somebody else to make sure that what I can offer to somebody else, the other person needs. And in that way, you can hope to have a solid relationship. Okay? All right, well, you're leaving tonight, guys?
Tomorrow morning.
Tomorrow morning? Have a safe trip back. If the Messiah doesn't come between now and then. In which case, you'll have your relatives and everybody coming here. But if not, then a safe trip back. And where are you going back to? To
Ohio, Columbus.
To Columbus. Very nice. Okay. Be well.
Can I circle back and try to re-ask my question? I don't think I understood the answer.
Yeah, okay.
The statement of I think of the Rambam was that if Hashem is one, he can't be physical. And the proof was that we don't have an example of a physical object that doesn't have numbers around it, that doesn't have...
Now we don't have an
pieces.
example, but if you understand what physical objects are, I mean,
Okay.
matter and form are intrinsic to every physical object. So we have a proof.
Okay, so matter
every,
and form alone.
Every
the
physical object is going to have at
characteristic
least
of the
2.
electron doesn't do the job as much as matter and form does.
That's what Maimonides uses. I wanted to make contact with the modern thing. Yeah.
Okay.
That does it. Okay, fine.
Yeah, that's it for me.
Yeah. Okay. Good. I just wanted to, matter and form is not modern vocabulary, but so I did it with electron. But I did say modern form because that's what that's what Maimonides talks about.
Yeah.
And he talks about that, by the way, in the Mishnah Torah, not just in the guide. Okay, guys.